Hello, my name is Clara Mavel and I set up the Cultural Entrepreneurship Institute in Berlin. Today we are in Munich and we will speak soon with Wolfgang Schmidbauer about his newest books. Hallo, Herr Schmidbauer.
Hello, Mr. Schmidbauer. Hello. Nice to see you again. Good to see you again, yes. Since our last interview, 3 years have passed. So let's start straight away with the question to you. What happens to love after a certain time, in a new phase of life? Does love change? I think it does. Yes, I think that love changes as people do. Or are you asking whether love is changing with society? Well, whatever occurs to you. Love over time, love in different phases of life, and society, yes, interesting. There's a new book there. I think both. As people get older, they change, and of course their relationships change too. I think that's a very important difference, perhaps. Whether a relationship can change or whether the partners cling to a static image and don't admit changing with each other, but try to maintain a kind of original condition by repressing what is changing. This does happen in relationships. It's risk. You sometimes hear that in therapy with couples where people say, so far everyone told us that we were a fine example to everyone, we never argue, we're a dream couple. And they say to us, if we could live the way you do, that would be wonderful. But now we're about to separate. And it's become unbearable. These are couples who don't tend to develop a climate where they can admit negative aspects and support each other through those, or not so nice periods with one another. And they don't learn to bear this, to mitigate, to temper this, to ensure that the other person doesn't suffer too much, but from the outset are concerned with this mutual perfection and want to preserve that image, and it becomes rigid. They're not able to develop with each other. That would be a personal biographical factor within that development of life, whereby I think if love wants to subsist, it must change. Just as it says in that wonderful saying from Il Gatto Pardo, bisogna cambiare tutto se vogliamo che tutto rimanga come è. Yes, we have to change everything to make sure things stay as they are. I think that's a very fitting quote. And of course then there is also a social factor, depending how society responds to relationships. That will make relationships change too. Yes, okay. All right, then we will talk about that in a moment. But first of all, I wanted to say that since our last interview, you've carried on being very productive and have produced some more bestsellers. I wanted to ask you, is that a ritual? Is it discipline? Or do you take pleasure in writing? Writing. I think that nowadays I would miss it if I didn't do it, if I didn't have a project that I could work on. And to me it feels like an excellent exchange, because in a therapy situation you have to focus on people. You have to attune yourself with other people, and you can't create much, you can't shape them, because people aren't, let's say, easily changed. It's not good in a therapy, because in a therapy you want to develop people, and it doesn't favor their development if you think they're putty and you can shape them. Whereas When you're writing, I think you certainly can be creative and shape things. And if you can transform relationships into stories and convey those stories, you can understand what's happening better. And I think gradually develop a career as a writer. If you do that, then you take pleasure in conveying these ideas to other people, to your readers, illustrating the kind of thing that you experience yourself in your practical work, that you learn about people and their stories, history, culture, the things that have become clear to you. So to me, I think it's a mixture, because there's a quality to the work, of course. If you want to finish it, you have to make a bit of an effort, you have to be disciplined. But it's primary pleasure, writing, and having that creative opportunity. So it's a greater sounding board for your thoughts. Yes, exactly. When you're writing, you come to understand yourself better. I think that's a very important motive. That when you're writing, you can clarify things. If I only think about them and I have a sort of feeling, then that feeling is volatile, the thought is ephemeral. But if you write, you can catch it and you have a feeling that you've created something. You've written that fascinating book about German marriage, Love in the Shadow of History. And you're talking about a very German kind of culture in love relationships. You say that there are particular categories of love in a German relationship, in an intimate relationship. Yes, it does change with culture. At the moment, in my practice, again and again, I have couples again and again who come from different cultures. And I think that over time, I've developed a specific response after looking at German couples. And it's interesting to look at this typology, this way that people react to each other in a partnership, and to link that into German history and draw some interesting conclusions. If you look at the historical literature, beginning with Tacitus on Germania, and also the history of how that book by Tacitus has been understood over the centuries, there, for example, fidelity is an extremely important value. If you like, sexual faithfulness is something that is specifically valuable to Germans compared with the rather lax qualities, let's say, of the Romance Latin countries. It's a demarcation. Just as you have, for example, the Germans' love of truth compared with the lying English. It's an idea, it's a nationalist cliché, of course, that has been around for a long time, since nationalism in Germany. We can observe this idea that the Germans somehow have a particular steadfast core which relates to truth and depth, whereas other nations of Europe are more superficial. I won't forget that either. It says that the Germanic people, says Tacitus, are not so interested in aesthetic things. True, superficial things are not so important. It's what behind it, virtue and depth. But then the question is whether that's true. In German marriages, what does play a role is the fact that it's okay to be badly treated in a partnership if it fulfills a good purpose. If one aspires to an ideal of love, then it's all right to maltreat the partner and work with poisonous pedagogy and bully them a little into achieving that ideal of a good relationship. Although as an Italian, I wouldn't necessarily agree with the idea that aesthetics is just surface. Yes, fine. As I said, that's a difference. And in German Romanticism, that plays a part. Okay, but you're the star on this occasion, so there's one model of the German marriage where you distinguish between 4 different categories which aren't confined to German marriages, but you say are particularly pronounced there: trauma, symbiosis, third-party hazards, and self-opinionated aggression. Do you think you could read those pages to us? That's pages 16 to 21 in your book. Because if you could, as you've written it down so nicely, we don't have to run through it all again. You can simply read it to us. I think it's always nice if an author reads his or her work. Okay, trauma. As a German, one inevitably knows more about genocide and cruelty than members of other nations. What did the Huns, the Mongols, do to the citizens of cities they conquered? Pyramids of skulls like Tamerlane built if a town did not surrender at once. What did the slave traders do to Africans? The Americans to First Nations, the British to Aborigines in Australia? Concentration camps were invented in the Boer War by the British. Stalin's rampaging was hardly less, maybe worse, than Hitler's. In Palestine, Israelis are letting Arabs die of thirst, and so on. It doesn't help much, though. Under pressure, people clutch at straws. But it's no good historicising the German genocide by building an artificial dam with a flood of other atrocities. The bureaucratic, racist disenfranchising of Jews, the ice-cold mass murder, idealised in its coldness, of women and children in Auschwitz and Treblinka, the abduction and exploitation of millions of people, the idea that neighbours, partners throughout a long history could be reshaped as colonies. The index of German sins is long and unique. It is a German index, however much we yearn to see ourselves as victims of Hitler and his henchmen. And that it should happen to us, the nation of poets and thinkers, of world literature, of the romantics, the finest poetry and the most profound tragedies, magnificent music, pioneering reformers, and philosophers who swayed intellectual history. This sketch of the crisis of self-idealization may as well be left incomplete. The contrast is certainly blatant. The abyss between the historical facts from 1933 to 1945 and the need to be good can hardly be bridged. We once believed, and had good reason, or thought we did, that modesty, pride in education, and refraining from colonial expansion were defining qualities of the German nation. We've been living in democracy and peace for almost 70 years now. Surely the German sense of self must have healed. Has it not long since restored those good old values? And is it not profiting among the victims of the former colonial powers from robes purged of at least such stains? But it isn't that simple. In families, the traumatic collapse of ethical attitudes has undermined the ability of children and grandchildren to draw inner resources from identification. It has induced manic compensations. The consequences can often be observed in people who have grown up since 1945, in the longest, most stable period of peace in German history. Second, symbiosis. When individuals lack the structural foothold for their emotions that family traditions can provide, they seek a new foothold. The construction of a modern marriage is one such option. As a connection between two people nourished by romantic love, it can attenuate the emotional insecurity of individuals, their anxieties about poor decisions and useless values. A weakened ego seeks succor by merging with a thou into a total indistinguishable unity, assumes the other person shares the same strengths, uses the other person as a mirror glass, and doubles the dividend on this invested power. The couple firmly bound in love is a universal hope of the modern world. Faced with the specific power of German traumatizations, This couple unites into a particularly intense, but also highly woundable symbiosis. Mutual confirmation, attention, and recognition compensate the lack of inner structure. As the collapse of the Nazi ideal of the super race tended to affect fathers and sons more than mothers and daughters, it is above all German men who seek the aid of the women with whom they blend into symbiosis. They can only experience and consolidate their masculinity if they feel adequately supported and endorsed by her. If his partner disappoints the symbiotic desire to complete this experience of his own masculinity, a man will start to fear closeness and relationships. Men fear the responsibility a family brings, and only want to shoulder this risk when they have found the absolutely right partner. An essentially similar strategy for resisting symbioses, applied by both sexes, is to choose a partner who is already bound. The idea is, if I can't realize my ideal, at least I will acquire someone to blame for the lack of success. Third-party hazards. The third person in a love relationship between a man and a woman is, apart from other symbiotic rivals, mother-in-law, ex-partner, career, the child. In a German marriage, a child is wanted, but not at first experienced as a third person that disrupts the symbiosis so much as the extension and perfection of the narcissistic desires invested in the symbiosis. In reality, the baby grabs many of the symbiotic wish fulfillments previously lived out unwittingly. Previously, the partners could read their symbiotic needs in each other's eyes. The baby howls. This competition is experienced as unfair. Partners feel neglected and suspect their erotic neediness is no longer recognized. If the symbiosis now crumbles, the German marriage will culminate firstens in an early divorce after one or both partners seek fresh symbiosis, second in one or two partial symbioses with the child, which keeps the alienated partners together, or third in a triangulation. This last scenario enables the relationship to open up to the third person without diluting the erotic element in the partnership. Given the new task, a part of the symbiotic relationship is relinquished without emptying the marriage of meaning. If more children are born, this does not mean that in every case the baby crisis will be resolved and the triangulation reinforced. This might be an attempt to shore up the damaged cohesion of a partial symbiosis. Further siblings are born. The partner's alienation only emerges when pregnancy and birth have exhausted their power to distract and the partners definitively do not find the way back to their love. Fourth, self-opinionated aggression. One typical trait of the German marriage is a form of engagement which entails normative lecturing, appeals to guilt feelings, and seeks to improve the other partner. Faced with the task of dealing with conflicting expectations, the partners will seek to recalibrate one another. They are not secure enough about their own values to tolerate their counterpart attaching importance to different values. Surely there can only be one idea of tidiness, cleanliness, healthy living, tasty food, sexual activity. Aggression within a German marriage is often not direct but indirect. It comes disguised as help, a suggestion, the attempt to offer a better solution, to point in the right direction. If the other person does not follow, they are either envious of this superior knowledge and therefore maliciously refuse to respect it, or too narrow-minded or not intellectually challenged enough to accept their role as a pupil. When a sense of guilt and anxiety about failure are aroused to force another person to redouble their efforts, we call it black or poisonous pedagogy. Rather than supporting the partner in achieving a goal, he or she is threatened with devaluation for not improving. Fragments of the original symbiotic dynamic can still be traced in this treatment. Is the counterpart capable of achieving the desired change? The question is not asked. Empathy and perception are replaced by the underlying assumptions of the symbiosis. As all one's own skills can be inscribed without reflection onto the counterpart, ill will is the only explanation if he or she does not do what I would have done ages ago in his or her place. The symbiosis is founded on mutually ascribed ideals, and in any dispute these are to be repaired by means of reproach. The insinuation is that the counterpart made a promise that was actually never given. But rather than rejecting the projected image, the counterpart developed an idealizing counter-projection of their own. So they are now under an obligation to fulfill wishes before they have been spoken or even thought. These wishes are governed by the primeval fight-flight response. This splits a counterpart into two as if by magic. There's a good half, which promises security and protection from anxieties, which is why the threat of losing it also unleashes vehement fears. And there is also a bad half, which arouses vehement anger and must be fought and eradicated. As a result, a person who is the addressee of powerful desires for tenderness and closeness is shouted at and shaken to bring out the symbiotic counterpart which threatens, precisely because of this behavior, to disappear. Thank you. Thank you. You carry on by writing that in Germany, people are loved for achieving. Otherwise, there is a threat of depression. Can you explain that? Yes, I think in Germany there is a universal attitude. And I think actually this applies to any consumer society. It's an idealization of achievement, of performance. And by the reverse token, a failure to achieve is not processed realistically, but as a personal total failure, and hence leads to depression. And I think that also for the historical reasons we've mentioned, this attitude is particularly pronounced in Germany. Of course, it's part of the national character and the ascriptions that other European peoples bestow upon Germany, and which therefore also influence our own self-image, that we Germans are so diligent, and that we can create anything we put our minds to, and that we are disciplined, and that we don't strike so much, or are not so idle and lazy and negligent as our European siblings. And that for this reason, and I think people are in denial here, but it's important, hence the particular risk of depression. And if you apply that now to love relationships, if in a relationship both partners are undertaking great efforts and stimulate each other in their achievement, and do not develop options for relaxing together and recovering together, then the relationship will be stable. But once this highly burdened system, which I call manic defense, breaks down, the depression will ensue. It's a central problem here that this manic defense is not conscious as a big risk, and indeed as a defense mechanism. But obviously it has a shadowy, a darker side, it is a risk. And this awareness only grows once people have collapsed. And if the depression is very difficult, it's hard to do anything about it. So if people still have solid vestiges of their manic defense and are able to understand and to do something about some of this, if they come to therapy in good time, one can try to get them to restructure their lives so that the depression doesn't become too severe. But once the depression is there, and if the collapse has happened, then often there are no resources left to use psychotherapeutic means to help. And then, of course, in our society, people reach for the medication. But that doesn't really correct the mechanism. Perhaps what it can do is remove some of the strain on the weakened ego and give people an opportunity to accept that they are actually ill, which of course is difficult, especially if you are fixated on achievement. Weakness is taboo and mustn't happen. Then let's come to another point which is very important. When people separate that someone murders someone else, we're seeing more of it in Italy in recent years. Men who cannot take this frustration, this slight, perhaps fear of loss of masculinity, I don't know what it is. How do you see this? Why is it getting worse? Well, I think that this pressure to perform in society has increased. The ability to perform applies in more and more fields. 40 years ago, if you had a class of grammar school pupils, most of the boys and girls were quite happy with the way they looked and didn't really think about needing to look any other way. These days, a lot of them, including increasingly men, think about cosmetic operations or are not happy with the way they are. They want to optimize themselves. And if you look at this willingness to commit violence, we have to say these cases are rare. Even in Italy, it's not frequent that a frustrated husband kills his wife. And it certainly doesn't reflect our idea of progress in civilization, that's true. So I think it's important to understand that pressure on individuals is growing very much. And if you like, the ability to establish a rhythm of grieving, of accepting a period of grieving, which is quite appropriate, because if I live in a relationship and it then breaks down, I need a chance to say, well, that's a shame, that's sad, but it's not as if an evil person has done this to me and I have to take revenge. This form of reaction, that people think they must very quickly take action and vengeful action, is something that in the recent period has very much increased. Other phenomena too, such as terrorism, are part of that. And I later wrote that book about helicopter morality. And that is also about the fact that something that used to give people something to cling on to, structure, is now becoming almost a narcissistic weapon, moralizing, very quickly, very vehemently moralizing, and only later, after all this has happened, do people start to think about whether it was actually right. Or maybe we overlooked something in our quest for revenge. It's an illusion, I think, to believe that just because we have technological progress, that human abilities to process slights and insults improve. Quite the reverse. Technological progress is making a lot of things very comfortable, very easy. and leading to us not actually learning or not learning as much as we used to deal with the wounds, the failures, developing a kind of stoic quality and being able to bear these things. In a high-performance culture, the idea is, no, you can resolve any problem if you just try hard enough. And I think people are badly prepared then. This idea of living without violence, of grieving, these are indispensable if you want to process negative feelings. In your book, and I'm still talking about your book about the German marriage, you talk about how important it is to adopt a positive approach to processing the things that wound us. And in Germany, this applies to relationships, of course. Why is it so important, and how do you do it? I think, well, the why is it helps. It helps to stop you becoming depressed when you no longer feel anything anymore, because you don't allow yourself to feel anything. If you can't work with those feelings, if you can't process them, that's what happens. And a solution would be history, or telling stories, or taking note of stories. At the end of that book on German marriage, I try to talk about Adalbert Stifter, the writer, who addressed quite a lot of attention to people's wounds and how they dealt with them by telling stories and, quite simply, taking an interest in nature. That is, focusing on reality as a crutch, an aid against being overwhelmed by the deformity of reality that happens when we are hurt. I think it supports you a great deal if you see that reality is multi-layered and everything has two sides. And if I take an affectionate interest in those two sides, I think I can gain access to things that will heal me from the hurt. This is derived from my own personal biography. My grandmother on my mother's side had a very difficult life because her husband, my grandfather, was traumatized by the First World War. And she had had a husband who was cheerful, confident, optimistic about the future. And in 1918, she lost that man completely. He carried on working, but he took no pleasure anymore in life. He became extremely hypochondriac. And he wanted to be looked after in every little detail. And he also checked up on her all the time. Of course, as a child, I didn't really notice that, but later on, I very much admired what she did. She managed to preserve her pleasure in life, and I ascribe that partly to the fact that she, every few years, read Stifter's Indian Summer. She said, it's a book I can read again and again, it calms me down. And it is about precisely that, processing one big hurt, and doing that by looking carefully at life around one and working on the construction of a good life. Despite the shadows of that wound. It's depicted in great detail by Stifter, and I think this is a constructive way of building up another world which helps. This is a function which art has, and indeed craft. If I have something that I can do well, and where I can make my own decisions, where I can influence things, I think this is an important aid which helps us to recover from hurt. so that we do not subordinate ourselves to the wound or allow it to defeat us. For me, it's writing. So kind of coming out of this obsession or fixation with ideas. Yes, yes, being able to distract oneself from fixation on a trauma. In your work, The Soul of the Psychologist, a biographical fragment that you recently published, you talk about your life and your love life. I wanted to ask whether there was a trigger. What made you do this? Yes, it's a story which is actually a long time ago. And at the time, of course, it moved me very much. It's the story of my first wife, who suffered from a psychotic illness, fell ill while we were together. Right at the beginning, she had psychotic episodes, but I was so in love, I was in denial about that. And we had a few very happy years as dropouts living in Tuscany. We had 2 children. And then at some point, this life we had together, and then the sudden breakdown in our love relationship caused by the psychosis was something I could no longer bear, and I left her. It's almost 50 years ago now. The beginning of the relationship and the end of the relationship. And the actual trigger was that she died. And then I started again to think about that feeling I had, because I knew I could talk about her now without offending her, because I would have had to ask her. I couldn't ask her because we didn't have that kind of relationship and she wouldn't have understood. And then I started to write about this story. And also our life as dropouts, above all in the 60s, and the dramatic end to that in 1972. Of course, it's a story which had a huge influence on me and ultimately led to me becoming a psychoanalyst. I had been an author, a journalist, a medical journalist. I was able to live off what I wrote, and that's why we were able to live in Italy. I was incredibly naive about how one deals with severe mental illnesses of this kind. And I think, of course, that as a therapist, one tends very much to focus on one's skills and not one's failures, the things one was not able to do. But in fact, it's the errors that we learn from much more effectively, because an experienced therapist who always has an answer to everything is a rather repressive figure. And so this completely inexperienced, naive young psychologist who made so many mistakes interested me and moved me emotionally. So when I was reading that out from the book on German marriage about trauma and poisonous pedagogy, you find that example in the book. I was no better in the way I treated my first wife, but of course at the time I knew no better. And I was interested because it's a time, and it's astonishing how quickly things are forgotten. What life was like back then, how we responded to the environment, the importance of having a car or painting a house, how you approached it, using the simplest of resources. And I thought it was interesting to come back to this story. I think it helped me to process it. And my daughters agreed that I should publish it. I did ask them, because of course it's partly their own past that's there. La Bella Biondina. Yes, La Bella Biondina. And she's about 52. Ina, my older daughter, the day after tomorrow she'll be 50. Well, congratulations. But Italy and the 60s and 70s, that's a dream that so many Germans had. Yes, of course, it's the country where the lemon trees blossom, according to the poem. Yes, you describe it. I know it's a cliche. You say Germans sought redemption in the land of the lemon tree, which blossoms and bears fruit at the same time, crosses the Brenner Pass, and comes back either not at all or matured and chastened. What happened to you? Well, I keep crossing the Brenner Pass, of course. I go backwards and forwards. But that idea that you come back matured and chastened, I've forgotten. I've discarded that one. There's something absolute about that idea, that one becomes mature as a soul and that one is chastened or purged. Melanie Klein, the analyst, I would endorse, because she said that the process of growing up ends when we die. But I wanted to say, your book, there are a few terms that spring to mind. History, art, culture, aesthetics, culture, the culture of eating, the culture of welcoming people, of arguing, but also international and generous. Is that why Italy is so fascinating to Germans? I think you have to consider the period we're talking about, because I was very interested in this, looking back at this past. My first wife was very much traumatized by the Nazi period because her father was actually killed in an accident before she died, but he was a member of Hitler's bodyguard, and her mother was a rabid Nazi who backpedaled after the war and presented herself more as a Baltic aristocrat. That was interesting. These different stations that one constructed for oneself in families after 1945. And I had no idea of what was behind this. I very much admired it all. I came from a lower middle class family, and there's this baroness who loves me, and I love her. It was a fantastic constellation. And that's what made me stay in denial about the shadowy side. And then Italy, of course. My first wife lived in Italy for a long time. She studied in Florence and then worked as an interpreter there. I learned Italian from her. And we were totally convinced that in Italy, that rigid, depressing, compulsive, achievement-oriented construction effort that we had in Germany didn't happen in Italy. And of course, that was self-glorification. The interesting thing, in retrospect, was the fact that this Italian village, Mugello, Vicchio, where we were at the time, there were so many traces there of the past. Our nearest neighbour had been in Germany as a forced labourer. And the trauma of that was completely beyond his awareness. He would say hello to us and tell us how wonderful it was in Germany as a forced labourer. And our other neighbours came from southern Italy. Also, total strangers in Tuscany. They were held in contempt as Marocchini. And they would say hello warmly as well. Everyone was very kind to us because, just like us, they had arrived in this exotic world where they didn't belong. And it was only gradually over time, when I learned the language properly, that I started to understand this. And that was a very important experience about cultural factors. I'm very glad I had that experience, but it shows how emotional it all was to begin with, and how over time it took for those illusions to be corrected. And of course, that's painful, because one has these illusions, one makes these mistakes, and one doesn't want to correct them all, or one doesn't correct them all. A lot of them can't be corrected. It's also fascinating to watch how you turn from revering all this as a student, this wonderful Italy, you learn the language, and how you turn into this irritated husband, having to teach her to drive, quite regardless from her illness. A lot of people have been through a similar situation. But you had the courage to write about it, and most people wouldn't do that, to write up the story. Well, ultimately, I don't know whether readers will pick it up, but there's a lot of self-irony in this book. So from that point of view, I think it's an optimistic book, although the story with my first wife ended very sadly. But I think that somehow we treated each other very well, and the children. And that was the point to this work. What I think is really fantastic is that from a certain point, you described this and Tuscany isn't enough for you anymore. But coming back to psychology, you didn't just want to escape the symbiosis and Tuscany and this alienated or exotic life. You wanted to plunge into something, and you wanted to do that through psychology, change something. Yes, yes. But then that was a little bit more realistic, to the extent that I did this with a group of people. But of course, we had illusions too, because at the time we thought that probably by using group psychotherapy, we had this idea that we could create liberated zones where repressive society would have no role to play. We set up a training institute, and over time, this institute became quite successful. I still work there. But it's clear that it isn't a liberated zone. If you want to organize training courses and prepare people for their professional development, you need a lot of rules and checks. And ultimately, I'd say you can try to develop a stance by remaining detached from all these ideas of salvation. And perhaps that is feasible development for us, but it's not redemption, it's not salvation, because that would mean that we could resolve all problems, including for the future, and I don't think we can do that. But of course, you can remain open to development.